This is Simple English News Daily. I'm Stephen DeVincenzi. Today we have a bonus episode, different to our normal 7 minutes of daily news. Today I'm speaking to Professor Graeme Robertson about the life and death of Alexei Navalny. Navalny was a Russian opposition leader and anti-corruption activist. Navalny was recognized as a political prisoner by Amnesty International and other organizations, and won human rights awards for his work. He was part of protest movements from 2011 to 2013, during which he was arrested many times. His fellow protest leader, Boris Nemtsov, was shot dead in 2015. In 2020, Navalny was poisoned with the chemical Novichok, but survived and recovered in Germany. During his time recovering in Germany, he tricked one of the people who poisoned him into admitting the poisoning by pretending to be an FSB agent. In 2021, he went back to Russia despite knowing that he would be put in prison and may be killed. On Friday, the 16th of February, Russia's prison service announced that Alexei Navalny had died in a prison in Russia's Arctic Circle. My guest today is Graeme Robertson, Professor of Political Science at the University of North Carolina. Robertson is originally Scottish and has a light Scottish accent, but he has been in the United States for many years. Professor Robertson is an expert on Russia, Ukraine, and the politics of authoritarian regimes. He co-authored the book Putin versus the People, which I will leave a link to in the episode notes. I didn't know this until after I spoke to him, but the Russian government added Professor Robertson to a list of people who are banned from entering Russia on Monday, possibly because of other interviews he has given about Alexei Navalny. This podcast is free, but if you would like to help to support us and have access to the transcripts of every episode, including this one, and our weekly news quiz, then go to send7.org. We give 10% of our profit to effective altruism charities. Now I bring you Professor Graeme Robertson. I'm joined by Professor Graeme Robertson. Professor, thank you for joining me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
We're going to talk about Alexei Navalny today. But before we do, could you give a brief summary of your background and things that you've been focusing on recently?
Yes, so I'm a professor of political science at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm also the director of the Center for Slavic, Eurasian and East European Studies. I have been working on Russian politics and Ukrainian politics for about 30 years now. More Ukrainian stuff recently than before, but still very heavily focused on Russian domestic politics and really on the issue of why people support Putin and why do they support the war. This has been a big topic I've been working on for the last 2 years, obviously. Public opinion and the Russian opposition also is something that I've worked on for about 30 years. And so that's my background.
Fantastic. Well, you'll be the perfect person to ask this question to then. Why was Alexei Navalny so significant?
So Navalny was so significant for a number of reasons, but I think the primary one was that Navalny had a charisma and a talent for reaching out to people and making contact with a much broader group of Russians than any oppositionists had done to date. The opposition, the kind of standard opposition electorate in Russia is maybe about 10 to 15% of the population. There's a number of different people who compete for the support of that group. But Navalny was the only one of those who could reach beyond that group into a much broader swath of the Russian population. Part of the reason that he could reach beyond it was because, quite frankly, he was very good looking and very charismatic. Another reason that he was able to reach beyond that is that he was incredibly smart and witty, and had a real talent for pulling stunts and doing things in a way that was both eye-catching and really annoying for the Kremlin. He also focused upon issues that many perceived were the Achilles heel of the regime. So his main organization was the Anti-Corruption Foundation, and his work was basically on anti-corruption for many years. And that is a very sensitive point for the Russian regime, because the Russian regime is based on corruption, and it works through state contracts that enable the enrichment of not just Putin, but a pretty large circle of people around him. And so that's really the core of the system. And Navalny recognized that, and he also recognized that this was the core weakness of the system, because corruption is unpopular. It's unpopular everywhere. And so those are three really good reasons why Navalny was so hated and feared in the Kremlin.
Navalny was poisoned in 2020 and recovered in Germany, but he made the kind of surprising decision to go back to Russia in 2021 after he was recovered. He likely knew that he was going to be arrested and likely killed as well. Why do you think he made the decision to go back to Russia anyway?
So the main reason, I think, is that he wanted to remain relevant in Russian politics, and he understood, or he made the calculation that if he stayed in the West, his prominence would fade, and the challenge that he represented to the regime would be weak. If he went back to Russia, on the other hand, and was arrested, he would become a symbol of the resistance. He would become a symbol of courage and opposition to Putin's criminal regime. And he, I suppose, must have calculated that he would live longer in prison, long enough to see the end of the regime. Now, why people do extraordinarily brave things like return to that situation like Navalny did, someone like me who would never really understand, I think, because that takes a moral and personal courage that's really exceptional. And so I that's why when you ask that question, I always hesitate to answer, because in my heart I can tell you reasons, but like there's a moral fiber there that I think is just works on a different level. And as you say, they were under no illusions about what would happen when he went back to Russia. I read a few days ago an interview with another Russian activist, and he was recounting how before they returned to Moscow, he spoke with Yulia Navalny in Berlin. That's Alexei's wife, and he said to her, if you go back to Russia, they'll put you in prison. And she replied, well, if we're lucky, they'll probably put us in prison and probably kill us too. And so there was no question that they knew what they were getting into, which to my mind makes it all the more extraordinary and amazing.
Yeah. We're speaking on the 22nd of February. So Alexei's death was reported last Friday. How reasonable is it to assume that he was killed by Putin's regime?
I think there's absolutely no doubt about it. And there's a number of really strong reasons to make that assumption. The first is that he appeared in a video link in court the day before. He supposedly fell ill. He was very strong. He was in great spirits. He was making jokes. He looked well. Thinner, obviously, after this time in captivity, but well. His own doctor made a statement that, going through his medical history and saying that there was nothing in his medical history that was consistent with the first story that the Russians put out, that he had suffered a pulmonary embolism, that he just didn't have any underlying condition that made that at all feasible. And then it's really interesting to note that very quickly the Russian official story, they moved off the pulmonary embolism story into sudden adult death syndrome, right? And they tried to kill him before. So, they tried to kill him in 2020. They tried to poison him. Very nearly succeeded in killing him. So clearly, and while in Germany, Navalny was able to investigate the assassination attempt against him, and actually spoke on record with the GRU officials who carried out the assassination attempt. So clearly they had opportunity, they have motive, there's no other explanation. And then to put the icing on the cake, they've taken away the body. And they won't let anyone examine the body. And so, that's murder. It's because I don't think there's any question about it.
Yeah. If he was already in prison, from the perspective of the Kremlin, what is the point of going that extra step and killing him when he could remain behind bars for the rest of his life?
Yeah. So their calculation, presumably, is something along the lines of while he's still alive, he's a potential threat, even if he's in prison. While dead, he is silenced. He was very effective, actually, communicating with the outside world while he was still in prison through messages to his wife and through messages to his other collaborators on Team Navalny, as they called themselves. And so those messages, presumably, the Kremlin considered to be a threat. I also think there's a certain attitude within the Kremlin that people who cross them get killed. This is the sort of, that fate is what, awaits anyone who crosses them. And that message is something that they want to be understood. So recently, just this week, there was a Russian pilot who defected to Ukraine about a year ago during the war. He was found murdered in a parking lot in Spain.
Listeners to this podcast will have heard that story in Wednesday's episode, actually, where that was.
So you covered that, yeah. And I think the message is pretty unsubtle, right? And I think Navalny, unfortunately, sadly, is part of that same message that they want out there.
Do we know how popular Navalny was in Russia, or is?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because this is a guy who is incredibly popular amongst a certain section of society. A guy who is presented as, Putin is running for re-election next month. Navalny was presented as the only person who would be a serious, candidate to run against Putin. But we never really got to see how popular Navalny could be, because he was basically thrown off the ballot for the presidency back 6 years ago. The only time he ran for office was he ran for mayor of Moscow in 2013, I think it was. And he, basically was able to acquire about 30% of the vote there. Most Russians, if you do surveys now, most Russians have heard of him. Most Russians have only heard negative things about him, though, because what they've heard about him is what they've seen on state television. And so I think it's fair to say that he is probably a huge cult figure, but amongst a minority of Russians. But he never got a chance to actually, perform on the public stage properly due to the bias of the media there. Had he been allowed to do that, I think his impact would have been much larger.
With Navalny dead, what is the state of opposition in Russia today?
Well, it's really grim. It's very, very dangerous to be involved in the opposition in any way. There are two other very prominent opposition leaders, Ilya Yashin and Vladimir Kara-Murza, who are also in prison. Kara-Murza also had been poisoned on at least one and probably two occasions by the regime before. So one worries a lot about their fate. The opposition in exile is pretty large now. About 1 million Russians left at the beginning of the war. Not all of them by any stretch of the imagination for political reasons, but many of them left for political reasons. So there's a large diaspora, but it's very difficult for that diaspora to connect with Russia. It's very difficult to actively organize in Russia. Navalny had a large network of activists all around the country. I assume most of them have either left and the ones who haven't have gone underground because it's really not safe. And so the liberal opposition is under a lot of pressure. Some people have proposed or suggested that the murder of Alexei Navalny and the fact that his wife Yulia has stepped forward to take up his mantle could be a unifying factor for the opposition. And that would be if that was were to happen, I think that would be a good thing. But it's very early to tell. What I think is also really interesting now, and as the product really of the war, is that when I think of opposition to Putin, I used to always think about liberals. I used to always think about Navalny, and that's who we meant when we used those terms. But there's a new actor on the scene now, which is the kind of the ultra-right, ultra-nationalists who think Putin's not done a great job of the war and should have done better. And they are much more prominent now than they were before. And so that's kind of an interesting. It's changed the really what it means to be in the Russian opposition. I think like there's now two camps, very, very, very different camps. And I think that's one of the most interesting developments we've seen in the last couple of years.
Those more pro-nationalist, pro-war people that you're speaking about, they've also been persecuted more recently as well. Now, obviously, the killing of Yevgeny Prigozhin last year, and the ultra-nationalist Igor Girkin, Strelkov, who was involved in the original war in the Donbass from 2014. He's been jailed, I think, for quite a few years as well. So that side has also come under attack by the Kremlin more recently, I think, no?
That's right. The Kremlin, listen, it doesn't brook much opposition. And as I mentioned before, people who cross Putin get, end up in bad ways. And they've made that very clear. What was really interesting at the start of the war was that this ultra-nationalist flank was really helped to legitimize, I think, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, at least in certain circles. And then, of course, once you let these people loose, they become very unpredictable. And I think Putin has seen that.
Yeah. What will the legacy of Alexei Navalny be?
Well, it's early days, but I think that the degree to which the international community has already gathered round and really lionized him shows that that his international impact is really huge, and I think he'll always be an icon. And if and when this regime falls, we'll look back on the history of it, and this date will be significant in that story. The big challenge is, or much more uncertain thing, I think, is his legacy in Russia and what that'll look like. People who are really popular in the West tend not to be very popular in Russia. You think about someone like Gorbachev, right, who was a big hero in the West and really despised in Russia. And so it's hard to know how that's going to shake down. It'll depend. If one day a liberal regime takes office in the Kremlin and really reforms Russia, then Navalny will always be seen as a father figure to that movement, and a moral touchstone. On the other hand, that's not terribly likely, to be honest, in the short to medium term. And so the Putin regime will do everything they can to make people forget. Now, the emotions of this moment are very strong, and we've seen hundreds of people all across Russia, thousands of people even turning up to lay memorials and really give quite touching, statements about Navalny and what he meant to them. So we'll see. He'll always live on in their minds. But in terms of the broader population, I think it's unclear.
Okay, thank you, Professor Robertson. If people want to follow you and your work, where would you point them to?
So with my co-author Samuel Green, we wrote a book called Putin versus the People, which is available in paperback, and it's very accessible. I hope interesting account of why it is that many Russians do support Putin, and they do. And so if you want to get an insight into that, that's a really good place to look at it. The other place that you can find me is the Authoritarian Politics Lab at the University of North Carolina, where I publish research with my team of graduate students and other collaborators.
Professor Graeme Robertson, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Stephen. It's my pleasure.
My message for the situation when I am killed is very simple: not give up.